Tim, how are you today?
Ray, how are we doing?
Doing good. Want to know? I'm feeling better and better about this Chiefs game as I go along through the week. One thing I'm not feeling great about right now, Dallas Goedert. 3 straight days not at practice. Are we at this point just ruling out any possibility to see him on Sunday?
I mean, that's the way that I'm operating right now. When you have a player that misses the entire week, and there hasn't been like a ton of optimism around that injury for this week, I would say anyway. So I'm operating of the mind that he won't be out there. Official report will come out later today, so we'll see what his status is. But yeah, I think it's probably fair to say. And Will Shipley is sort of a similar deal where he's been sidelined all week, and that continued today. And so I think you go forward with the mind of they're probably not going to be out there.
Believe it or not, Nick Sirianni believes in the depth of his team. We heard his presser earlier today, and he was talking about that tight end room, obviously spoke glowingly of it. But in the absence of Goddard, it's not something we haven't seen before. But how do you size up that tight end room as we look towards a week without Dallas Goedert?
Yeah, I'm not as bullish on the tight end room as Sirianni is, or at least is professing to be. I mean, you know, it's not a position that they have really invested in. And I thought that this past off season, like, it felt like a good time to do that. You can't force it, obviously, in the draft and those kind of things, but you know that you have a tight end in Goddard who is very good when he's on the field, but isn't on the field as much as you would like because of injuries. I mean, he's got a very clear injury history that signals that you're probably not going to have him for some games. And then, you know, there's Grant Calcaterra, that's your primary backup, and you have Granson. But, you know, really, if you look at that opener against the Cowboys, when they had 2 tight end sets in there, and that was with Goddard, they weren't very effective running the ball. And so what happens when you take him out of that equation when he is your best blocking tight end? It leaves you with a tough scenario where I don't think that you're going to be able to put 2 tight end sets out there very much at all. So they're thin right now. Calcaterra has done some decent things in the receiving game in spots in replacement of Goddard, but I don't know that you can really feel super bullish about that position given that you haven't invested a whole lot of resources into it.
You just talked about the blocking there, and that's something that goes beyond just that tight end room. I know Jordan Mailata spoke yesterday and said they were 1 block away sometimes. And going back, looking at week 1 and looking back to the Super Bowl, obviously the running game, which was the hallmark of this team all through last season and has been for years at this point, but especially with Saquon Barkley. What did you make of the running game's struggles, especially in that fourth quarter, not being able to really pick up the yardage you would expect?
I think Saquon Barkley probably put it best yesterday when he said that, you know, you'd be foolish if you're the opponent not to come into each week trying to stop the ground game and having that be your primary focus. I mean, we saw that with the Chiefs in the Super Bowl and the passing attack. Jalen Hurts were able to take advantage of that. But I think that you'll see probably a similar recipe from most defenses throughout the course of the 25 season, which is, Barkley is absolutely amazing, and they have a great offensive line. How can we not shift the focus onto there? And I think that the Cowboys did that as well. And so I would expect that to continue. I mean, even though Steve Spagnuolo got burned in the passing game in that Super Bowl and it wasn't pretty, you know, they were able to limit Saquon Barkley. And so maybe you just sort of play the odds there, where you're saying, all right, well, maybe Hurts has a great game and the passing game is on point, but there's also, you know, some evidence that it's not always flying super high. So, yeah, I think until they sort of prove otherwise, that's what the Eagles can come to expect.
And the passing game a conversation because of the lack of targets for A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. Are you expecting this offense to be a little less risk-averse in week 2, or, hey, it's not broke, don't fix it?
Well, you know, Jalen Hurts' comments after the game were pretty telling when I asked him about how he thought the operation went between himself and Kevin Patullo. And the thing that stood out to me is Hurts said there are times where we have to be less reactionary and more proactive, and that we have to trust our instincts. So if you're trying to boil that down, like, what is he talking about for week 1? It seems like maybe it's aggressiveness in the passing game, because it was, I would say, pretty conservative passing game plan there. They had the one to Jahan Dotson, but everything else was pretty much short yardage. And so I think that, you know, there is a desire to open it up a little bit more. Certainly, it's got to be the top of your mind if you're Sirianni or if you're Kevin Patullo, of like, yeah, we gotta get AJ involved like pretty early here. 4 catches for 24 yards combined between he and Devontae Smith is not something that you want to walk away from most games from. And I feel like there's some opportunity. The absence of Justin Reed in the secondary, he's now in New Orleans, opens things up deep. So I do feel like the Eagles will try to push the ball downfield some.
Speaking about Sirianni, you wrote about Sirianni today, a great story about just handling success and how you kind of build from taking a team to the mountaintop and not letting it just be a one-time experience. What was the biggest thing you took away in the conversations and just doing the reporting that led to that story about the way Sirianni wants to handle the year-in and year-out success of the Philadelphia Eagles?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, first of all, Ray. And I would say that the conversation with Gino Auriemma was pretty illuminating for me. One, because he took us into the psychology of a coach who's just won a championship, and he called it both the best thing that happens to you and the worst thing that happens to you, which is an interesting way to put it. And the reason why it's the worst is because you get mentally consumed with trying to repeat. You get concerned that you're going to be a one-hit wonder. And then there's all of these different sort of tentacles off of success, whether it's maybe members of your team get complacent. Maybe it's because in free agency, there's going to be highly desirable players that are going to leave, and you have to find replacements. There's all of these different things that you don't necessarily on the mountain climb up the first time that you have to do the second time around. So I thought that was really interesting. And also, Auriemma basically giving him a tidbit of his psychology, which was because Sirianni went to Auriemma and they were talking about this idea of, okay, once you get up to the top, like now you're the hunted. You're no longer the hunter. And Auriemma sort of flipped that on his head for Sirianni. He's like, why can't you guys be the hunter? Why not have that mentality of we're not defending anything. We're the ones on the attack. And by the way, we already have one. And, so we've shown how good we are, and we're coming after another one. And so I think that's something that Sirianni has sort of applied to his thinking and his messaging throughout the course of the first couple of weeks and during the preseason. And I think it's something that'll serve them well.
Yeah, you could see some of the parroting of that message from Auriemma to him, I think, throughout the entire offseason. I thought it was a really good read. People should check that out on ESPN.com. Keeping with Sirianni here, what does it mean to him to go back to Kansas City now that they have the revenge of a Super Bowl victory over the Chiefs?
Probably not as much as some other trips. I mean, you saw the emotion that he left the game with at Arrowhead the last time. How do you like that, Chiefs fans, or whatever the phrase was. So I'm sure he'll get it a decent amount from the fans out there. But they have sort of achieved their mission as it applies to the Chiefs from last year, being able to get their get back, get a Super Bowl title. And so I think right now it's basically just trying to make it as business-like as possible, where you're not bringing in the extracurriculars. You're not really bringing in your own personal emotion about your relationship with that city, the times that he had coached there, the fact that he wasn't retained on Andy Reid's staff when he took it over. I think you put all that sort of stuff aside, and you just make sure, especially after an undisciplined performance against the Cowboys, that your players are buttoned up and just focusing on what they need to take care of.
And looking into this matchup in Kansas City with Mahomes and an Eagles secondary in which we still have questions about what's going on at cornerback opposite of Quinyon Mitchell. They have questions about who's available at wide receiver for them this week. What do you make about the matchup between Mahomes and the back end of this Eagles defense?
Well, Mahomes is going to come in motivated. And that Andy Reid is as good as it gets at finding ways to scheme up and take advantage of weaknesses by the opponent. And the Eagles are showing at least one pretty significant weakness in that cornerback 2 spot right now. And, the Chiefs don't have the receivers that the Cowboys have, clearly. But that being said, there are ways to take advantage of a vulnerability, even if you aren't having your star players that are going to be exploiting it. So I think a lot of it comes down to let's get the pass rush going if you're the Eagles. Not being able to generate much against Dak Prescott, obviously much different than what we saw in the Super Bowl. There's been some turnover along the defensive front and on the edge, certainly. They just picked up Zadarius Smith this week. Let's see if he's active and he's able to give them a little bit of a rush. But we know that Mahomes is excellent and that if you give him time, he's going to figure it out. So it's going to come down in large part. I don't think you're going to get any kind of miracle cure at CB2 right now. And so, it comes down in large part to that front generating pressure on Mahomes so he doesn't have time to pick you apart.
And who's specifically on that front? Because we talk about that Super Bowl. Obviously, Josh Sweat, Milton Williams, they're not walking through that door. They got their payday. When you look back at that Super Bowl, the way they were able to impact the game was massive. And they weren't the only ones. There are still guys here that had their impact on that game. But who specifically are you looking at based on the matchups with that Chiefs offensive line?
Well, I mean, you go to Jalen Carter first and foremost. That was a big part of the equation last week, not on the field. And that affects everything. Like Moro Jomo, he looked so good during the summer. And you didn't see him flash quite as much in that opener. He had a tough matchup, and he didn't have Jalen Carter on there. But when you have Carter and he's attracting that much attention, then obviously your job gets so much easier. And if you're that consumed with one player, just look at the Packers game last night and the way that the Commanders had to think about Micah Parsons. You know, when you're using that much effort and brain power on one player, then everybody else's job along the front gets easier. So, yeah, I think that Jalix Hunt needs to have a better performance in week 2 than he did week 1. And I think that there's, just basically everybody across the board does, but things get easier when Carter's in there. So that's obviously something to watch is, what does he look like coming off of the suspension? He's saying all the right things afterwards. His teammates are saying that he's motivated. Like, what does that look like when we get to game day?
All right, we could dance around it, but let's get right to it. The feelings on the game Sunday for the Birds.
So they shifted a little bit for me, right? Coming into the season, I was like, because of the revenge factor, it's like, all right, that's got to be a Kansas City win. But then watching both of the teams, the lack of juice that Kansas City had on offense and a couple of vulnerabilities that have popped up on defense led me to believe, like, maybe they just don't have, enough firepower to keep up with Philly. I think if the Chiefs are going to win, it's going to be more of like, okay, the defense does find a way to turn over Jalen Hurts and the Eagles. They're getting prime field position, and then Mahomes is sort of making it work from there with limited resources. But barring that, I think that if you're just stacking up, player to player, the Eagles have the advantage. So I'm expecting them to go in and into Arrowhead and win.
Tim, I always appreciate talking with you. I appreciate it more when you just validate my exact feelings for a game.
That's what I'm here for, my brother.
I appreciate it. That was pretty much my entire line of day. If you go from Monday's show to Friday's show, it's like, yeah, W's and L's. Back in May, I was like, yeah, revenge game. Obviously, Chiefs take that one at home opener. Coming into the week, Chiefs really going to start 0-2. Now I'm sitting here like, what logic outside of prevailing narrative and tangible things are really leading me anywhere towards but an Eagles win in this one?
Yeah, I mean, there's the psychology to the sport. There's no question about it, and it's in favor of the Chiefs there. So you definitely weigh that. They are 0-1. They are at home, and so I'm not saying it's going to be any kind of rollover. But if you're going matchup specific, and you believe that the Eagles are going to be able to at least come close to matching the energy that the Chiefs are bringing, then you have to like Philly. That's
where I'm at with this one. Well, I'll get a chance to talk with you pregame. I'm looking forward to that. But thank you as always, Tim, for joining us here on the Midday Show. Hey, it's Ray Dunn from the Midday Show. Thank you so much for watching our content. If you want more videos, you can click right here. Or how about you subscribe right here so you stay in the know on all that's coming from 97.5 The Fanatic.